Welcome everybody, Christina Wolf here, and this is another session of empowering or discovering the empowered self. And today we have with us Miss Brenda King. Is it Dr. King?
It's Dr. King, but whatever.
Yeah. And Dr. King is a clinical psychologist, and she has agreed to be part of this lovely interview series about healing ourselves from early childhood trauma. And Dr. King, can you tell us a little bit about what you do for your clients? I know you also do coaching as well, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's really fun to be part of this. Yeah, so I've been a clinical psychologist for a little over 15 years now and kind of work with a broad range of people, ranging from really, sort of coaching daily problems to some pretty intense trauma work with clients. And given that 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 women has had some trauma in her life, for most people, share that shows up in some way. And so I started out with pretty traditional psychology, sort of traditional. Well, I guess probably really traditional in that my background is more in the psychodynamic. And so I do a combination in my therapy, sort of psychodynamic, which is sort of interpersonal relationship, unconscious processing. And then sort of a lot of people nowadays are trained in more sort of thoughts, behaviors, feelings, dealing with that. So I do a combination of that, sort of wandering. But over time, I started coaching because I wanted to incorporate some of my experiences and knowledge and skills that I wasn't using in psychology. Since as long as I can remember, I've done shamanic journeying before I even knew what it was. And so I've continued to study that and do a lot of that with my coaching clients. I'm really intuitive and have come to be really aware of how much intuition has played a part in sort of my psychology practice. But in coaching, I was much more open about it and identifying it. And so it ended up sort of being 2 really separate things, but it's really fascinating how the 2 have blended together so much. Because I'm finding as I've opened up and sharing sort of the energy work and healing and shamanic practices in coaching, the clients are coming into my clinical psychology practice talking about these things. And sort of there's been an invitation then to share and start working that way also with some of my psychology clients. And so I always say I do kind of a blend of science and soul and kind of working those 2 together.
Yeah, they're very complementary.
Psychology's, oh, totally. Yeah. And especially for trauma patients. Because trauma, it encompasses so much of who we are as a person at all levels. I think one of the things that happens with psychology is, some of the psychological treatments can just kind of deal just with the thinking, just with the brain, and there's really a lot of advancements and integration in that way. But I do think bringing in the energetic piece, it's really empowering for clients and sort of helps then where your mind, body, spirit, you're sort of healing at all levels and all parts of who we are as people.
Yeah, thank you for explaining all of that, because I do think it's really important from my own experience to explain to people, anyone else listening, if they're on a recovery journey, they may have gone to counseling, talk therapy for years and never really got a chance to tap into the trauma piece. Because to me, that was a piece that was in my body. It wasn't something that could be addressed just talking about it if you're all up in your head. And many trauma survivors are all up in their head. There's a big disconnect from your body. And some of the things I think I've been able to address in coaching, and then I've been able to address in therapy. And I think it's just, we're going to talk a little bit about complex PTSD versus PTSD. But when we say complex PTSD, it's because there's a complex set of circumstances that created the trauma. And so it makes sense that a complex way of healing it would have to take place. So why not have both therapy and coaching? And in like me and you both work in shamanic healing modalities, the journeying, the energy healing, all of that mixed in with talk therapy and things like EMDR, which I think we're going to discuss a little bit about. All that in combination is like so helpful to get into the trauma response in the body, not just talking about it, you know? So I know we sort of talked a whole bunch of things all at once right there, but let's clarify for our listeners, what is complex PTSD versus PTSD? And how is that relating to people recovering from early childhood trauma?
So I think often when we think of PTSD, or you think of sort of simple PTSD, is when there's been maybe one event and it's happened in a context where there's some support for the person often. And so it's pretty limited, because part of PTSD, it's a memory or an experience that gets stored differently than the rest of our experiences. Like trauma memories, like they just get contained in their own way. So when you open up that package, you are actually re-experiencing what's going on at different levels. And so simple traumas or simple PTSD often is by the book symptoms. So you can kind of go down the checklist and sort of say, oh, that's PTSD. Often the story is pretty clear and crisp about what happened. And often it's much easier and much quicker to get past it. It's often one or two experiences. You know, and it's always a continuum, but that would be sort of the extreme. For example, just really quickly, an 18-year-old that had gotten into an accident on interstate and couldn't drive a car at all, and like with 2 EMDR sessions was kind of back to driving on interstate without any fear. That would be like simple PTSD. Complex, like you said, is often where there's probably been difficulties with trust, with being understood, with being heard. There may have been multiple experiences of boundaries being broken and actual abuse. And so the story is much more complex, like you said, and so it affects person's self-perception, how they view the world, their relationships. So it's much more pervasive in how they live their life and how it affects different areas of their life. And symptoms always aren't clear cut, because often people with complex PTSD have really developed some wonderful ways to adapt and to cope, because humans are incredibly resilient. And so sometimes if you take like a simple checklist of PTSD symptoms, you may not even get very many of those boxes checked because they've adapted and found ways to kind of work around things. And so sometimes it's almost harder to sort of come at. I've had patients with complex PTSD with even like dissociative identity disorder, where sort of multiple parts, and they've been in therapy and no one's ever even recognized that it was trauma that they were dealing with. And
so, like, you can be misdiagnosed as, you know, quote, crazy or whatever story it is that, you know, or label put on you, but how much of what you're doing is truly your body's wisdom and at adapting to like a horrible thing that's happened to you, or horrible things. And the complex part is, I find that when you're talking about self-perception and reality, the biggest thing when I started doing research on early childhood trauma is your sense of identity is affected. And people who have been in this trauma response their whole life and never known it just think, this is who I am. they think that they're flawed. They think that they don't have the ability to form good relationships, or I'm just messed up. And what would you say to a client or, you know, a patient, for, depending on who they are, coming to see you, about that sense of identity that how would you help them to overcome that flawed sense of identity?
I mean, I often will start, either way with helping them or trying to help them see how adaptive and how creative they've been, and sort of finding some ways to own all the strengths that they've shown. And so in part, can you see all the ways where you've made some really good choices to protect yourself when you weren't given any tools to do that? You've had to make it up on your own. So trying to flip that a little bit so that they can see all the positive aspects of what they're doing, even if it's not working in their life now, to be able to look where it was a perfect solution at one point. And so it was a wonderful thing, and that's often the trouble, is sometimes they've learned some ways of dealing with things that maybe aren't working in the present, but they were the perfect solution in the past.
That's what's causing them to seek help, because it's their previous self-sabotaging ways are creating, havoc in their life now. But at one point that self-sabotage was self-serving. They were trying to do something, trying to help themselves ultimately.
Yep. So I think that's the first part, and then the other part is really, trying to help them step back, because the other part, often when you're traumatized, I think, like you just, that sense of self, really, like all the boundaries around self have often been ripped away. And so it's sort of hard to have this separate sense of self, separate from what was done to you or the people around you. So trying to create some distance so they can look back and give back some of the things that they've taken on and realize that's not theirs, and try to separate that out a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really important, to differentiate. Like, you're not what happened to you, you're the observer of what happened to you. And that observer self is the piece that we need to connect to really anchor us into a space where we can dive into some of these really harder memories. And I love how you talked about how trauma memories are stored differently, because for early childhood trauma, me being a deputy, when in our training they talk about when we go to family violence calls, that it's really the little ones, the ones that can't even talk, that have the biggest struggle later in life, because they've stored that trauma and those feelings in a nonverbal way, and they can't articulate it, and they can't go back into those memories until they've addressed it in a nonverbal way. That's why the talk therapy doesn't necessarily work, because all of these trauma memories are stored in our body, and we're maybe in those triggers. So can we talk a little bit about some of the tools that help get into those trauma memories and reset them? Like you talked about EMDR and hypnosis, and I've personally tried EMDR, and I will say that, like, you can't explain why it works, but it works. And it's just like a relief, a huge relief, because when you're in that triggered place, you're in your like reptilian brain, right? And this EMDR somehow interrupts the story that you're telling yourself, So can you tell us a little bit more about how that works, and what exactly is EMDR for someone who's never heard of it?
So EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it initially started out with moving your eyes back and forth as you pay attention to, thoughts, feelings, emotions, pay attention to some aspect of the trauma. It's evolved, so there's different types of bilateral stimulation, and it's thought that in part it's a bilateral stimulation of the brain and crossing the two parts of the brain back and forth a lot of scientific explanations. I've actually done some research on EMDR, and I think, that there's multiple factors that go into it. But like you said, one of the key parts is a lot of traditional trauma therapy was retelling your story. If we retell our story, we're actually just deepening those pathways and sometimes consolidating that memory versus breaking it up. EMDR, a lot of it is you aren't even talking, as you're sort of just experiencing what's going on in your body, your thoughts, and you're just kind of letting things come up. And you really kind of have to experience it to feel it. But it's like these experiences kind of bubble up out of your body, out of your subconscious. And so you get pieces of the trauma showing up in the context of being witnessed in space that's kind of being held by the therapist. And I think that's part of EMDR is a bit of the re-experience in a safe held space.
Mm-hmm.
And that relationship, and that the EMDR keeps you present because you're getting this physical stimulation. You're interacting with your environment at some level while you're still tapping into those really deep experiencing of the trauma. So then I think it creates this bridge also between present and past. And so it kind of moves you out of that, like it kind of blows up the story, brings you into the present. And so then you can kind of start recreating your experience, is part of how I understand it.
I think, like, for me, I have boys who play video games all the time, and to me it's kind of like the best explanation is you had a glitch in your system and it was like on repeat and repeat, like kind of like the Matrix, and EMDR kind of goes in and like interrupts that glitch and like lets it settle back down into a regular space where it can be compartmentalized. It's not triggering you anymore. It's not disrupting your daily life anymore. Because you can be in this trauma response and not even know it. You just think that this is normal. You're this level of stress in your body. And when I think for me, when I sought out therapy, it was when I was just constantly being triggered. I just like always unhappy. Something always set me off, or I always felt like it brought up these intense feelings that I couldn't control anymore. And it was just time. It was like, this doesn't feel normal anymore.
Yeah.
Like I can't hide my crazy, And I think that's when people finally say, I need to do something about this because like I'm just not happy anymore. I want to be happy. It feels like you're watching life through the glass ceiling. Everybody else is having this good life and I'm just not someone who can do that because of who I am. But really who you are isn't like, you're not what happened to you. You're not your traumatic memories. You just need to learn how to tap into that healthier part of yourself, to quiet or calm down those triggers basically. So EMDR, like you're saying, you can do, used to be with eye movement, but I've seen them use like little like buzzers, like in one hand and another. And it may seem like quackery or whatever, but I don't care. If it works, right?
Yeah. And there's a
hypnosis.
lot of research and personal, experience in working with clients. It can make a change when nothing else has sometimes.
Yeah, I think that some of these traumatic memories, like you're saying, are pathways, neural pathways. And as you talk about them multiple times, like you were saying, it just you create a very strong neural pathway, and when you're feeling triggered, then suddenly everything is triggered. Like your brain just sort of like, it becomes a virus in your operating system. And it's really good to go in and like interrupt that and break up that pattern. So any other clinical tools that maybe a therapist would use that, or even a coach? Like I know shamanic healing, the journeying is another way to go in and break up that neural pathway, like soul retrieval. That's pretty much what I think when we're talking about restoring the real self, finding that wounded self piece and bringing it back to you. How can you combine the EMDR with like shamanic healing and kind of create your own sort of treatment plan, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, and you kind of went back to, I think more and more psychologists are using energy work in these, and you can find some therapists that will do both in session. I also have certainly worked with clients, like you said, that have a coach and a therapist. And so working with alternative healers along with your therapist, a lot of therapists will be very open. And even, if someone chooses to even talk with your alternative practitioner, and work with them in ways too, at times can be helpful. And like hypnosis is sort of this mix. Like hypnosis, in many ways, I go by, like, how is it different? But like with hypnosis, you don't go into the energy. It really is, I think, more of an imaginative. I think, hypnosis, people go where they are with it. But I'm very hypnotic and really responsive to hypnosis. And when I get hypnotized, it's very different than a shamanic journey. But I think hypnosis is another way, like in terms of even traditional therapy, of being able to tap into the subconscious and some of those nonverbal aspects, because it's really rich with imagery. Hypnosis really sort of brings up sort of all the five senses experiencing of things and being able to shift that using your imagination, which then I think can shift the story, shift the energy, even if someone's not even purposely aiming at shifting the energy. I think when you use your imagination intention, you kind of do that automatically. There's one more thing quick, is there's also now more therapists are getting trained in somatic experiencing. And so that's a newer therapy, but it really focuses on learning to modulate your physical experience and finding that place where you can calm your body and you can tolerate levels of arousal without it triggering sort of that neural pathway. And so there are some ways, even with psychology, that they're now approaching through your physical body to be able to shift things.
Yeah, I think that combination of mind body is the key, frankly, because you can talk all day long about it and it still never really tap into, well, when I'm triggered, I can't really think straight. So like, let's get into why my body's suddenly feeling really stressed. My throat's tight. I'm sweating, or I just have this internal sense of stress, like just sitting here, that makes no sense because it's not like a tiger's chasing me, but my thoughts are going and they're creating this stress in the body. And I think that's what the EMDR and the hypnosis and shamanic journeying like help interrupt. And like we were saying, the complex PTSD creates this need for complex ways to come at it and deal with it from different levels. And that somatic therapy, I've heard where they put people like in pools of water, where they're getting like resensitized to feeling being in their body. Because a lot of people don't even, especially like sexual trauma survivors, have completely cut themselves off from feeling their, womb or whatever. It's like that part of their body just feels dead to them. They don't feel the energy in it, and they've never even had someone point that out to them to say like, or they're not even recognizing that they're quote feeling dead in that area or numb. And when you talked earlier about like it being a safe environment to open up and talk about this stuff, I think that numbness is one of those self-sabotaging things that like at one point served you because it was so traumatic you couldn't feel it. You would have fallen apart. It would have disrupted your sense of survival. But now going into, a therapist or a coach or whatever, they'll give you those skills like that safety net or anchoring for you to go and explore and then be able to to dive into that pain and release it finally. You know,
Yeah.
that's, to me, like, create the best support system you can. You know, the counselors, therapists, coaches, energy healers, even your yoga instructor, like, phenomenal
Yep.
at helping you get into your body. You know, just, so it's scary to get into your body if your body is the thing that hurt you, if it felt hurt, you know, pain, if
Mm-hmm.
if being in your body felt shameful or stressful or whatever. Like, a lot of people tell me, I feel I have dissociative tendencies. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean? Like, I'm not in my body. My consciousness is over here somewhere. Like, I can't really, because if I'm in here, I start feeling a lot and it doesn't feel good. And so I'm curious, like, what do you do for, like, helping your clients get it into the body?
I mean, I work a lot with grounding, and sometimes depending upon what they're open to, sometimes it really is just, like feeling your seat on the chair, your feet on the ground, and just physically sort of some safe, really neutral experiences of being just, connected to the world. And for other clients, I think that are open to it, I really think if you can do the energetic grounding in terms of letting that negative energy into the earth and taking up energy from the earth, because I think that when you can add the energetic piece, then you become a part of the world in a different way also. And you feel supported by the bigger world. So it's another way to kind of step back out of your experience. And sort of there's mix. But I think, so definitely grounding exercises, and finding even like the small, simple things that you can enjoy. And again, the five senses, but like the taste of foods that you like. And sort of instead of being in your whole body, can you start with sort of some simple experiences that you can enjoy that part? Because one of the costs of not being in your body is then you also don't get the joy of being alive and the pleasure, because so much pleasure and happiness is a physical experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the really hard parts of complex PTSD and people often being miserable, is because they also are shut off from the good parts. Because when we shut off the negative, we also shut off all the positive experiences. And so
Our ability
kind of,
to receive, basically.
yeah, very much so. And so, finding like what are the small ways, and then start expanding on that. And so, like even relaxing, you have to find, like so many times people will start with, some therapists, coaches, and working with trauma will start with relaxing, but traditional relaxation is not safe and will often trigger panic attacks in people.
Yeah,
And
because the
so
wound
then,
happened while you were feeling vulnerable and open. And
yeah,
being vulnerable and open doesn't feel safe. So why would you do it, right? It's
yep. And
restoring
so
that
you
safety.
kind of going back to figure out how can you be empowered and relaxed, or how can you be empowered and receiving. um,
I'm so glad you mentioned joy and pleasure, because I think if you're in this trauma response, joy and pleasure are so disconnected. Like, and then you start getting this meaning making around, like, I just can't feel good and there's something wrong with me. Well, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just stuck in this trauma space that, like, isn't allowing you to receive joy and pleasure.
Yep.
You just have to disconnect from it. And it's not as easy as that. It's like, just disconnect from it. It's happening to me automatically. Like, I don't know why I'm just, this stress. And, I think we add the meaning making about, why can't I just be normal? That creates even more of a story for us, our sense of identity. Like, well, I'm just messed up. Because I'm messed up, I sabotage all my relationships, and now I'm just going to avoid relationships because being close doesn't feel good, and I get triggered, and that's where the avoidance comes in.
Yep.
And so I guess the goal here is, if you do the work, you allow yourself to be able to receive that joy, that pleasure, that feeling of safety, things that you just thought weren't possible for you. It can just open up this whole other realm of living. And if you've been suffering really for a very long time, you don't even know what it's like to feel good. It's kind of scary to feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. Like suffering almost can become part of the safety too in ways. And so sometimes letting some of those negative experiences, you kind of have to have these little windows of experiencing it's okay to be like that and then take it back on. And I think sometimes for people too, to know you're going to move in and out of it, and that's okay. It's not like you're going to drop it away and it's going to be done. And for some people just, can be a little bit, it can be self-defeating when they move back into some of the ways they've been protecting themselves, and to feel that that's a bad thing. And it's like, no, that's great, because that means you're still protecting yourself, and you can learn how to do this in and out, and you're the one that's now having some control over when that protection comes into place.
Yeah. The more I'm interviewing folks for this series, the more I'm getting this message of, don't judge yourself, don't blame yourself for these perceived flaws of self, like there's something wrong with me. No, lean into it and let yourself feel those feelings in a safe place, in a self-supporting environment, so that you can process them and let them go, and not have to feel like a sense of suffering or suppression if you're, especially if you're feeling really anxious, or it's creating dysfunction in your life, like, don't judge yourself for it, because the judgment itself is going to just perpetuate the wound, frankly.
Yeah.
So
yep. And
one other thing I wanted to talk about is this ability to tap into your future self. I think we talked about it in one of our interviews before. And for me, this was a huge piece, especially when I started my own business. I triggered and self-sabotage so much about like goal setting and your future self. And this is a kind of a little piece that I think people who are in a trauma response don't necessarily attribute to trauma. They just think, oh, I'm a failure. I'm procrastinating. I'm not good at things. I'm a good starter, but I'm not a finisher. How can trauma affect your sense of future self?
Yeah, like psychologists call it foreshortened future, but often if you've been traumatized as a child, if you talk to people, they often have a certain age that it's like there's no future beyond that. And I think in part it is because that identity got disrupted, and so you're so much kind of in the survival mode that you're not looking ahead. And so you've never, and as a child, that's often when we start daydreaming of being a mom, being a teacher, some of those things that we see out there, and we start. But I think if you're a child who's being traumatized, you're not even identifying with some of those figures that kind of help create that story out there, as much as it may change. And, and so then, yeah, if you start making plans for the future and you never thought about even having a life after the age of 23, like, how do you start planning for the next 10 years of your life when you're still like amazed that you are where you're at? And I don't even really have a good explanation of it, but it's kind of, as you kind of get back into your body and start changing that story, the future starts opening up a little bit, and you can start. And that's one of the reasons I really like sort of shamanic work and journeying, and hypnosis a little bit to the same degree. But it's almost, from a shamanic point of view, it's like there are multiple lifelines, and we often are on one path. But through shamanic journeying, you can go and you can sort of search for different lifeline or different destiny line. And so then you can kind of put yourself on this different energetic path, which then all the other things you're doing at multiple levels can make it energetically a little bit easier to get to sort of this different place in the future, and to have the energy to start imagining it. And
so what would you say about someone who says, I don't feel it's safe to be seen and heard? I hear that a lot, especially people who with goal setting or whatever, they're not able to allow themselves to receive that success, or to, like I was saying, feel safe to be seen and heard, or be their authentic self, or sustain success maybe. How much of that is due to that disruption of self and from the trauma response?
I think, I would think that there's a huge part of that where, and a lot of times because of self-regulation issues and having identity, all that, there's can be like an all or none. So that if I make myself visible, I'm totally exposed. And so part of it really is, even as we talk about authenticity, vulnerability, all those types of things that are sort of buzzwords in coaching, is to be able to say, you can be authentic and you can be present, and it can be a half inch of your story, not, and so being able to sort of identify that authentic doesn't mean I'm standing naked in front of a crowd. It means I'm sharing this moment and what I'm feeling right now. You don't have to take it back to the future back to the past. And so sometimes it's even working on thinking about being seen in a different way, and recognizing you can protect, and you can say, I'm going to let this much of myself be seen. And so part of it's managing what are you going to show, and the other part again too is kind of really developing that sense of strength, and going back and recognizing how resilient you've been and what you've been through, and putting in perspective that if you show up on Facebook, that nobody's going to throw anything at you that you can't handle, because you're already sort of this rock star at handling bad stuff. And so part of it's continuing to flip that story. It's like, I'm a superstar. Look at what I've handled. I'm still here, and I'm still figuring it out. And so tapping back into those strengths.
Right. And this, I had this thought that maybe your fear of being seen and heard was like a smart choice at one time. It wasn't safe for you to be seen and heard, because maybe you had a very abusive household, and the quieter you were and the good child that you were, that was your way of protecting you. And so to like really honor yourself and not let it be like a flaw or a block or whatever, just returning to a place of safety, and not judging yourself. The other thing also is, if you had the opposite of abandonment, but like engulfment, you had a smothering parent, relationships feel exhausting, because if I state my preferences, that caused a whole bunch of drama with the parent or whatever. You're not, how could you do this to me? Blah, blah, blah. There's lots of enmeshment in relationships. You may have abandonment issues, but you may also have enmeshment issues, and stating your preferences and being known and seen and really saying, this is what I want, caused a bunch of drama for you in your life. And so that can be exhausting. And so your fear of intimacy might be a natural response to engulfment or enmeshment in a relationship, a primary caregiver relationship. So you're not really flawed. You're doing what would naturally take place if somebody was smothering you, basically.
Yeah.
So like, let yourself be okay that that's what's going on with you. And now once you get okay, then you can move past that story, right? Move past that trauma response to being seen and heard. And truly enjoy being in the limelight and self-actualizing and not worrying about engulfment, because you've built up some very strong boundaries or self-supporting habits that allow you by degrees to receive more,
Yep.
basically receive more.
Yeah. And very much so, because part of it is learning to love yourself, and that's a big part of trauma work, is learning to love and accept yourself. Um, and so when you get to the point where you truly love yourself and value yourself, you can start feeling really good to have people appreciate you and to be open to that level of receiving, and know that you can pick and choose which stuff you're going to let in, because you've learned to regulate that. And so you can take in the good stuff to the degree that it feels good, and you can filter out the stuff that you don't want to hear.
Exactly.
And you'll,
Well, and I like that word you used, self-regulation, because that can be a sign that you're in the trauma response, that you've had this early childhood trauma that's keeping you from learning how to self-regulate for so long. And that's, once you become conscious, like, oh, this is what I'm doing, this is why I have difficulties in this area, and it's, maybe not my fault. I was just doing what my little childlike brain could think of to adapt to these circumstances. And, I think because I did a lot of meaning making around self-regulation. One of them was, why am I always late all the time? Well, because for me, being in the here and now, my consciousness is over here, la la la, like coming into the present and focusing was very stressful for me. I've been disconnected from my body for so long, because it was easier for me to check out. What was going on in front of me was a bunch of chaos and drama and abandonment and, painful feelings for a little child. So kids live in that little dream world. And so I stayed in the dream world, living in La La Land. And so being on time was stressful. Like, I never learned how to be in the here and the now. And so time management, things like that, self-regulatory things like, oh, it's time for bed because I'm feeling tired, but I'm so disconnected from my body that I'm not listening to that internal wisdom, in all of that aside, when you realize, oh, I'm just struggling with self-regulation. I'm not like a lazy person because I'm always late, or I'm not, poor discipline, like whatever story they want to tell you about procrastination and all these other things. Some of that has to do with your trauma response and your inability to regulate yourself. And it's not that a character flaw, basically. So that's really important to understand. Like, this is why I'm doing this stuff, because I'm stuck in my trauma triggers. If I get out of that, then I can be focused. I can actually show up for appointments when I'm supposed to. And I never even thought these would be things that were part of the trauma response. I just thought,
Yeah. And that's like that complex where it
who
shows up.
Your identity of who I am versus like what's happened to you, your response to what's happened to you. So
and I think like play and inner child can be a really big part of this. And so learning to play means that you can try things without there being big consequences. So ideally, if you can kind of get into that play space of, being curious and trying things and, with low risk. And sometimes if one way to do it is to sort of think about that inner child and you as the adult self, and all the ways that you can protect yourself now as an adult and have control over things that you didn't before, and almost consciously go meet that inner child and find the playful part. They never got to play. Bring them into the present to play with you, protecting them. And I think even in business and online, there's ways that if you kind of use that concept of play and inviting the inner child to have this different experience, it's another way to break up that story, but to be able to try some things out and to push sort of what's been comfortable in a way that can feel good.
Right. Yeah. And if you fail, be more resilient about it, you know? That's the goal. Well, thank you, Dr. Brenda, for
Tell me,
being with
Brenda.
us. This has been like a really enlightening, interview, because I just really think that some people don't even know what's available for them, or that I just thought that was just me and who I am. And if it's causing you some kind of suffering or dysfunction or inability to meet goals that you have for yourself, definitely you deserve to find some relief from that. And it's really important to convey that to our listeners. And I think if people are listening, they already kind of either have an inkling that they want some relief from something, or are someone who can offer relief. So, it's really important to get that message out there, because I think I was unconscious to a lot of my trauma response for a very long time. And it's just all about identity.
Yeah, and I think it's important for coaches who, haven't been trained with trauma or may not have had trauma themselves to also understand some of this stuff. Because, if you're finding yourself and a client stuck or having struggles, there may be a trauma aspect to it that neither one of you are recognizing. And so you want to have it kind of in the back of your brain so you're not adding to the problem.
Right.
And I think occasionally there can be the risk, if you have two people that don't realize that what's happening comes from trauma, there can be frustration and almost a re-experiencing this unnecessary of some of the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So just my little, so I think all coaches should sort of be aware of this information, which is why, I think it's great to have this, so they know when to reach out and say, hey, could this be, or should I refer on, or, for both clients
I almost
and
think
coaches.
It's like a necessary part of when you go into business for yourself, because entrepreneurship is something that is a huge trigger. It's a huge trigger of your sense of self and who you are, what you're able to do, and the pressure that we put on ourselves to up level and make more money than we've ever made, and to serve so many clients, and but if you can't even get the basics of self-regulation down, it's like, I'm fatally flawed. And no, you're not. You just have some trauma response to heal. You have some healing that needs to take place so that you can bring your amazing gifts to the world, and that's a lot of what I'm doing with this interview series is addressing so many gifted people, healers, shamans, coaches, whatever. So much to bring to the world, but they can't get past their trauma response to bring it. And there's nothing wrong with you. You're not a failure. You have the ability. It's just heal yourself. Learn those self-supporting ways so that you can be in the here and now and out of that trauma response. So, I feel like I'm kind of saying the same things over and over again, but it's so important to understand this. Like, you're not what happened to you.
I can guarantee that if you move through some of this, you are going to have some of the most amazing gifts. You may not recognize them now, but I guarantee you're going to find some amazing gifts if you haven't discovered them yet.
Exactly.
Always.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining me for our interview. And how can our listeners find you outside of this interview series?
So you can find me at my website, brendajking.com, or you can find me at Brenda J. King, PhD, which is my business page on Facebook. So,
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And thank you for our listeners who stayed with us. And bye for now. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.